Hello everyone. Today I will be talking about gender in two different art periods which correlate with this topic, as well as a contemporary artist today who responds to gender. To begin, we will start with the Northern Renaissance art period. One of the main ideas behind this certain period was humanism and depicting the human body in the art pieces. Humanism at the time was basically focusing more on humanistic approaches to situations and shying away from the Italian Renaissance and their high belief in religion. This idea relates to my topic of gender because they would seek only rational ways of solving human problems. Therefore, the gender roles that they assigned were not because God wanted it that way, rather that was what they believed was right and that it should be that way. As for the standard of beauty, the Renaissance artist's perception of beauty was determined by his philosophical environment, his visual experience, the period eye, the demands of his patrons, and by attempts to enhance his professional status in society to equal that of poets and architects. Often the same facial type was repeated in many different paintings. Renaissance portrait artists tended to avoid realistic interpretation, emphasizing instead the positive attributes of their subjects, both physical and political. The depiction of beauty in Renaissance art is shown to be more complex than a photograph-like representation of sexuality or of a person's physical appearance. Instead, Renaissance art created physically perfect images resulting from scholarly expectation, the artist's ambitions, and his developing skills. An artwork that addresses the topic of gender during the Northern Renaissance is Portrait of a Young Girl, Christus. It is a small oil-on-oak panel painting by the early Netherlandish painter Petrus Christus. It was completed towards the end of his life, between 1465 and 1470, and is held in the Gemäldegalerie, Galerie, Berlin. The painting is described as the girl reflects the Gothic ideal of elongated facial features, narrow shoulders, tightly pinned back hair, and an almost unnaturally long forehead, achieved through tightly pulling back the hair and that has been plucked at the top. She is dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry and seems to be uncommonly elegant. She looks out to the canvas in an oblique but self-aware and penetrating manner that some art historians have described as unnerving. This artwork addresses the topic of gender because even back then there were gender roles and a clear distinction as to how women should be and what they were good for. For example, in this painting the girl reflects what women should look like and what women should want to look like. Some identifying qualities of the Northern Renaissance were paintings that depicted interiors, which were bedecked with beautiful jewel-like objects like crystal pillars and detailed tapestry. Many paintings depicted the education and social status of the person in the painting. They were also big on humanism. While researching this, what was interesting to me was learning about how humanism was a big influence and a big part of the Northern Renaissance art period, and that there is such a huge distinction between the Italian Renaissance art period and the Northern Renaissance period in terms of that. You would think that those periods would be similar and very religion-inspired, however that is not the case. Each differs from the other in their own way. Moving on to abstract expressionism, the art of this time was responding to surrealism, which was a movement that they translated into a new style fitted to the post-war mood of anxiety and trauma and political instability in Europe in the 1930s. These ideas relate to my topic of gender because at this moment in time, women were finally getting to showcase their artwork, and it was not all male-dominated anymore. Women played a key role in the articulation of the movement as early as 1942. Lee Krasner's work was exhibited alongside Jackson Pollock's, who would be her future husband. Joan Mitchell, Pearl Finn, and Mary Abbott were regularly invited to the members-only A Street Club, founded in 1949 by Willem de Kooning, Ad Reinhardt, and others, and Elaine de Kooning and Helen Frankenthaler, who later married Robert Motherwell, were included in the seminal 9th Street exhibition alongside Krasner and Mitchell, organized by Leo Castelli in 1951. Women also participated in the museum shows of the day. Grace Hartigan took part in the 1956 MoMA exhibition, 12 Americans, which also featured paintings by Philip Guston and Franz Klein. The standard of beauty for the abstract expressionist paintings were to emphasize free, spontaneous, and personal emotional expression, and they depicted freedom of technique and execution to attain this goal, with a particular emphasis to evoke expressive qualities such as sensuousness, dynamism, violence, mystery, and lyricism. They showed similar emphasis on the unstudied and intuitive application of paint in a form of psychic improvisation similar to how surrealists created something without thought or intention, with a similar intent of expressing the force of creative unconscious in art. They displayed the abandonment of conventionally structured composition built out of discrete and isolated elements and their replacement with a single unified, undifferentiated field, network, or other image that exists in a structured space. And finally, the paintings filled large canvases to give these aforementioned visual effects both monumentality and engrossing power. An artwork that addresses the topic of gender during the abstract expressionism period is Woman 2, Oil on Canvas by Willem de Kooning, 1952. It is one of many of de Kooning's women art pieces, which is a series that began towards the end of the 1940s and continued into the following decade. It upset both fans of his early canvases and those who were more used to refined, respectable depictions of the female form. These paintings of buxom, vampish females, knotted up in that of abstraction, took detours from earlier ladylike forms into a new and violent direction. Judith Hilser, who wrote the book A Way of Living, The Art of de Kooning, said if the facial and anatomical distortions of these figures reveal kinship with Picasso's famous series of paintings of Dora Maar, de Kooning's handling of the figure within the space is far more fluid and energized than the rational geometry of Picasso's cubist interior spaces. This particular piece addresses the topic of gender because it shows women differently than what they are supposed to look like, rather going against all of the odds and expectation of women's roles. During this period, it is when women were finally starting to come out of the shadows and be equal to their male counterparts. Some identifying qualities of the abstract expressionism period is that the art was championed for being empathetically American in spirit, monumental in scale, romantic in mood, and expressive of a rugged individual freedom. One form of painting that was done during this period was action painting, which is characterized by a loose, rapid, dynamic, or forceful handful of painting in sweeping or slashing brushstrokes and techniques partially dictated by chance, such as dripping or spilling the paint directly onto the canvas. Jackson Pollock first practiced action painting by dripping commercial paints on raw canvas to build up complex and tangled yarns, coils, and knots of paint into exciting and suggestive linear patterns, while de Kooning used extremely vigorous and expressive brushstrokes to build up richly colored and textured images. Abstract expressionism had a great impact on both the American and European art scenes during the 1950s. The movement marked the shift to the creative center of modern painting from Paris to New York City in the post-war decades. In the course of the 1950s, the movement's younger followers increasingly followed the lead of the color field painters, and by 1960, its participants had generally drifted away from the highly charged expressiveness of the action painters. Some connections that can be made of both the Northern Renaissance period and the abstract expressionism art period is that within both periods, women were hardly a big part of the art. Women were finally starting to showcase their art in the abstract expressionism period, but even then it was pretty rare. While in the Northern Renaissance, women were primarily painted as a subject, yet they were not artists themselves. The most interesting part of my research on the abstract expressionism period was finding out how women previous to this period were seldom artists or credited for their work, and how during this art period they first began the first of many art showcases. But also, I found de Kooning's work to be very interesting, mainly because he defied the odds and painted women in a whole other light, going against the traditional way that they were supposed to be: soft, beautiful, and fragile. Lastly, a contemporary artist today who addresses gender in their own work is Nan Goldin, who is an internationally acclaimed American contemporary artist from New York. She is famous for her exceptional work in photography. Since our first gallery exhibition in 1973, Goldin has been steadily gaining attention for her intensely personal and spontaneous photographs that deal with subjects of sexuality and gender. Following her graduation at the Boston Tufts University in the late 1970s, Goldin moved to New York City, where she started documenting the new wave music scene and the city's vibrant gay and transsexual subculture. This is seen in her most famous series of photographs titled The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, which depicts drug use, violent couples, as well as autobiographical moments. Comparing all three periods from the Northern Renaissance to abstract expressionism to today, all three periods compare and contrast each other because each of them, they all depict gender roles, yet they also have a few differences through each of these roles. The Northern Renaissance depicted how women should be and what they were useful for, while the abstract expressionism period shied away from depicting women traditionally, and instead women were starting to be equal to men and starting to have their own showcases. And today, the art is very feminist and definitely shows women as equals as well as men, with a lot of the LGBTQ community being shown in the artworks that artists create when they are responding to gender as well.